You won't believe what happened after the HOA towed my pickup truck for violating a rule I didn't even know existed. Stick around to find out how I took on the system and exposed a Karen who was abusing her power. Make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the full story. One otherwise normal morning, I stepped outside, ready to head to work, only to find that my truck, my beloved pickup, was gone. I froze in place for a moment, scanning the driveway and street for any signs of something out of the ordinary. At first, I assumed I had parked it somewhere else by mistake, but then I realized I hadn't moved it in days, and it had always been parked right where it belonged, in my own driveway. My heart began racing as I looked around, searching for any clues. I checked the street for signs of an accident, hoping that it had been towed due to some mix-up or maybe a neighbor complaining. But the street was perfectly quiet and undisturbed. There were no flashing lights or tow trucks in sight. I figured I'd better call the local towing company to see if they knew anything, though I had never once had a problem with my truck being parked on my own property. When I reached the towing company, the conversation took an unexpected turn. They informed me that my truck had, in fact, been towed, and the reason? It was apparently in violation of HOA rules. I was stunned. I had no idea what they were talking about. I paid my HOA dues regularly, attended neighborhood meetings, and had always parked my truck in front of my house without issue. The last thing I expected was for my vehicle to be singled out for some vague violation. After a moment of disbelief, I asked who had authorized the towing, and the voice on the phone said it was the HOA. My frustration quickly turned into confusion and then anger. I had never been given a heads up about any new parking restrictions or rules that might affect me. When I arrived at the towing company's lot, I couldn't believe how much it was going to cost just to retrieve my truck. But more than the fees, I was furious about the principle of it. As I walked toward the counter, I saw her, Karen, the notorious HOA enforcer. She was the one who was always ready to report even the smallest infractions in the neighborhood. I'd heard rumors about her authoritarian approach to enforcing the rules, but I had never personally dealt with her before. She was standing there, arms folded, with a look on her face that screamed she was enjoying this. The minute she saw me, she smiled in that way people do when they know they're right and you're in the wrong. "Looking for your truck?" she asked almost too cheerfully. I immediately demanded to know why my truck had been towed. Karen, without missing a beat, gave me a cold, rehearsed response. "It's because your gasoline-powered truck violates HOA rules." I blinked, trying to process what she just said. I had parked my truck here for years. There had never been any mention of banning gasoline vehicles. "Gasoline vehicles are no longer allowed in the community," she stated flatly, almost like it was common knowledge. My mind raced, trying to understand what she was talking about. "What do you mean? When did this happen?" I asked, hoping this was some sort of misunderstanding. Karen explained that there had been a recent update to the HOA's policies, and they were no longer allowing gasoline-powered cars to be parked in driveways or on the streets. She made it sound like this was all part of an effort to go green, claiming it was an eco-friendly initiative that the HOA had implemented to help reduce emissions and improve air quality in the neighborhood. My head was spinning. I had never heard of this change. No one had told me about any new regulations. When was this rule put into place? I demanded. Karen smiled a little too smugly as she responded. "The rule was finalized a few weeks ago, and the notice went out to all residents." I was fuming at this point, realizing that I had received nothing in the mail or by email about any such rule. "I didn't get any notice," I said, feeling my blood boil. "Well," Karen said, barely suppressing a grin, "that's your fault for not checking the community's website." She then proceeded to tell me that if I had been more responsible, I would have known about the new mandate. But I still wasn't buying it. It didn't seem right. Why hadn't I heard anything about this? Why was it suddenly being enforced without warning? The whole situation felt incredibly personal. I had an older truck, one that wasn't flashy or particularly expensive, but it was reliable. It had been a workhorse for years, and now it was being treated like an eyesore, as if it was some kind of pollutant. I tried to explain that I hadn't been given any heads up, but Karen just shrugged, as if to say that was my problem. She had an air of superiority about her, as if she were the ultimate authority on the matter, and there was nothing I could do to change it. "So, you're telling me that I can't park my truck here anymore?" I asked, trying to hold back my frustration. That's correct, she replied with a matter-of-fact tone. And if you don't like it, you'll need to figure out how to comply with the new rules, or you can move out. I was shocked by how dismissive she was, and the absurdity of the situation hit me even harder. I wasn't even given an option to fight it. As I stood there, fuming, I knew one thing for certain. I was going to have to find a way to get my truck back, and I wasn't going to let this slide. But I also knew this was just the beginning. If I didn't take action now, this HOA rule would affect more people than just me. And if Karen was allowed to continue enforcing these kinds of petty and unreasonable regulations, things could get much worse for everyone. Determined to get to the bottom of this, I began researching the HOA rules as soon as I returned home. I scoured the HOA website, searching for any mention of the new regulations Karen had referenced. After hours of browsing through outdated documents and scattered posts, I finally found a vague notice buried under a section about community updates. The notice stated that a new sustainability initiative had been introduced, which in theory made sense. However, it was all very general and didn't mention anything specific about banning gasoline vehicles. There was no mention of enforcement details, no deadlines, and certainly no explanation of how this would apply to the homeowners already residing in the neighborhood. Feeling even more confused and frustrated, I decided to attend the next HOA meeting to get clarity. When I arrived, I could see the usual crowd of residents, but Karen was nowhere to be seen. I wasn't sure if that was a good sign or bad, but I was determined to confront the board about the towing incident and get some answers. The meeting began with typical small talk, complaints about landscaping, and discussions about recycling programs, but nothing related to the supposed ban on gasoline cars. After the formalities, I raised my hand, and when I was called upon, I wasted no time getting to the point. I'm here to discuss the recent towing of my truck and the new rule regarding gasoline vehicles, I began. I explained that I hadn't been informed about any such rule, and that Karen had simply told me my truck was in violation. Immediately, one of the board members, a mild-mannered gentleman named Mr. Thompson, looked at me with a blank expression. "There's no such rule banning gasoline vehicles," he said. My confusion deepened, and I could feel the tension in the room rise. "But Karen said," I began, only to be interrupted by another board member, Mrs. Collins, who seemed equally surprised. "Karen has no authority to make those kinds of decisions on her own," she added. We would have announced something like that at a meeting. My heart skipped a beat. This was not what I had expected. If there was no official rule, then why had my truck been towed? I demanded that the board take action and look into the situation, as it seemed clear to me that Karen had overstepped her boundaries. Mr. Thompson agreed to investigate the matter further, but he emphasized that towing was a serious issue and had to be done under clear guidelines. I felt a slight sense of relief, but I knew this wasn't over. As I left the meeting, I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen had either made up the rule or, worse, had twisted it to her advantage. I was now more determined than ever to get my truck back and hold her accountable. Over the next few days, I made a few more calls and sent emails to the HOA board, asking for an official statement on the matter. Meanwhile, I began talking to my neighbors to see if anyone else had experienced anything similar. To my surprise, several residents had complaints about Karen's overzealous enforcement of neighborhood rules, ranging from trivial issues like improperly placed trash cans to accusations that she had once reported a neighbor for leaving their garage door open too long. It seemed that Karen had a reputation for being a stickler for rules, often to the point of absurdity. I couldn't help but feel that she had targeted me specifically because of my truck, knowing it wasn't a new model and probably had a higher carbon footprint than an electric vehicle. My frustration grew as I realized the fight wasn't just about retrieving my truck. It was about standing up against an HOA system that seemed to be at the mercy of an overzealous enforcer like Karen. I needed to get my truck back, yes, but I also wanted to make sure no one else would be wrongly targeted by her in the future. I had to expose how Karen was abusing her position of power, even if it meant going public with my story. It was clear now that I couldn't trust the HOA to act on its own. I had to take matters into my own hands. After the HOA meeting, I knew I couldn't just let this go. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became, not just about my truck being towed, but about the way Karen had exploited her position. It was clear she was taking matters into her own hands, bending the rules to her liking, and causing unnecessary stress for the residents. I decided to take action and make sure this kind of overreach didn't happen again. The first step was to talk to more neighbors, gathering evidence of Karen's past behavior. I learned that several people had experienced similar problems. She had reported them for minor infractions, like untrimmed hedges or leaving their garage doors open for a few minutes too long. She had made herself out to be the rule enforcer, policing every little thing. It was becoming clear that Karen was using her role as a weapon, creating unnecessary conflict in an otherwise peaceful neighborhood. I felt compelled to confront her publicly. Armed with the stories of my neighbors and my own documentation, I drafted a formal complaint to the HOA board, outlining how Karen had been misusing her position, including the wrongful towing of my truck. I also included evidence showing there was no official policy against gasoline vehicles, just the vague, unsupported sustainability suggestion that the board hadn't even approved. I sent the letter to the board, demanding that they take immediate action. I also reached out to a few local news outlets, hoping to shine a light on the HOA's mishandling of the situation. The more I talked to others, the more I realized